Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, and in this video we're going to be looking at an example of solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. You may also hear this called solving a quadratic equation by the square root method, so it has multiple names but it's basically the same thing. And I chose this example intentionally because it can be a little bit tricky, and I'll explain why it can be tricky and how you can avoid making any mistakes. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get the terms that have x alone on one side of the equation. So I don't want that plus 13 there, so I'm going to get rid of it by subtracting 13 from both sides of the equation, which is going to leave us with negative x squared minus 12x is equal to a negative 13. So now that we have the terms with x alone on one side of the equation, we want to make sure that the coefficient to x squared is 1, a positive 1. And right now our coefficient to x squared is a negative 1. So if I look at the x squared, there's a negative 1, commonly referred to as a. The a is the number in front of x squared. That's in front of x squared. So I want to factor that negative 1 out and see what we're left with. So pulling out negatives is going to change the sign of everything that's left on the inside of the parentheses. So we're left with a positive x squared and a positive 12x. And all of that is still equal to negative 13. And if you're not sure of what to put on the inside of those parentheses when you're factoring that negative 1 out, I encourage my students to check what they have by distributing it back in and making sure that they have what they started with. So distributing the negative 1 to the x squared gives us a negative x squared, and distributing the negative 1 to the 12x gives us a negative 12x, which is exactly what we had up there, and so we have everything that we started with. Now that we have the negative 1 factored out, we are now ready to go on the inside of the parentheses and calculate the number that we're going to add in right there. And whenever we do something to one side of the equation, we also have to do something to the other side to balance it out. So now how we're going to calculate that number that we're going to add into the parentheses, we're going to look at the number that is the coefficient to x, which in this case is 12. We take that number, we divide it by 2, and we square it. So that gives us 6 divided by 2, that gives us 6 squared, which is a positive 36. So I put 36 on the inside of the parentheses there, and this is the point where things can get kind of tricky in this type of problem. Because what I'll see a lot of my students do is they'll say, okay, I put 36 on the inside of the parentheses there. I also need to add 36 on the other side of the equation, but that's wrong. That's what we don't want to do here. And the reason that that's wrong in this case is because we had to factor out that negative 1. So when we factored out that negative 1 and added 36 on the inside of the parentheses, that really gave us a negative 36 from distributing that negative 1 back to the 36. And so to balance the equation, I need to be putting a negative 36 on the other side of the equation. I'm going to move this out the way for just a second. One thing that I tell my students when they get caught up in this step is once you have that number added in on the inside of the parentheses, if you're unsure of what to put right there, just start distributing this back out. Distributing the negative 1 to the x squared gives us a negative x squared. Distributing the negative 1 to the 12x gives us a negative 12x. And distributing the negative 1 to the 36 gives us a negative 36. So these first two terms are good because we had those when we started off in the equation. What we didn't have was that negative 36. And so to balance the equation, we add that negative 36 to the other side of the equation. So that's one way that you can make sure that you're balancing the equation correctly. So now that we have all of that, I'm going to move this back. Now we are ready to go in and factor, because if we completed the square correctly, then what's on the inside of the parentheses should now factor into a perfect square. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to positive 36 and add up to a positive 12. And for us, that number is going to be a positive 6. So this quadratic factors into x plus 6, x plus 6. And I'll go ahead and simplify the numbers on the right side of the equation. Negative 13 and negative 36 give us a negative 49. And the reason that I kept what was in yellow is because when you're trying to factor, so what I have written in red, when you're trying to factor that, the number that goes in those two blanks will always be the same number, and it will always be that number there, the number that you squared to get that 36, okay? So at this point, we have negative 1 x plus 6 squared, because we have two of them multiplied together, is equal to negative 49. To use the square root method to solve this by completing the square, we need to isolate this x plus 6 squared. We need to get that by itself. And so to do that, we're going to divide both sides of this equation by the negative 1 so that that coefficient will cancel and just leave us with x plus 6 squared on the left side of the equation. On the right side of the equation, negative 49 divided by negative 1 gives us a positive 49. So now that we have the squared isolated, we're now ready to go in and square root both sides of the equation. You have to be very careful when you square root both sides of the equation. Do not forget to put plus or minus. Anytime you square root an equation to solve it, you need to put plus or minus. What the square root does is it comes in and it cancels with the squared on the left side of the equation. So it leaves us with just x plus 6. It doesn't cancel anything on the right side of the equation, but the square root of 49 is 7. So we have x plus 6 is equal to plus or minus 7. So we have two separate equations to solve. This is why the plus or minus is so important, because you have to solve the equation with the plus, and you also have to solve the equation with the minus. So solving both of these, I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides of these equations, because I want to get the x's by themselves, leaving me with x is equal to a positive 1 as one of my solutions, and x is equal to a negative 13 as the other one of my solutions. And so that's how you solve a quadratic equation, by completing the square or by using the square root method. I also want to mention before I wrap this video up is that you could avoid this whole tricky situation here, what we were talking about with what number do you add on the other side of the equation. It only gets real tricky if a is not a positive 1. That's when it gets tricky. And so from the original equation, I'll show you down here, we had negative x squared minus 12x plus 13 is equal to 0. We could have avoided that by starting this equation off and multiplying everything through by negative 1. So multiplying both sides of this equation by negative 1. Make sure you're distributing that negative 1 to all three of the terms on the left side though, which would leave you with a positive x squared, a positive 12x, and a negative 13. And it would still leave you with 0 on the right side. Anything times 0 is 0. Now your a, the number in front of x squared, would have been a positive 1, and that would have avoided any potential confusion when it came to figuring out what you need to balance the equation. But I also wanted to show you this method because a lot of times people don't think to go through and multiply both sides by negative 1. So whether you do it or you don't do it, you can still go through and solve this equation. Thanks for watching. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Please like it. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more videos, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.